Final Fantasy VII Remake. The first remake, as this time around Square Enix decided not only to remaster this game on the budget of a full AAA game, no doubt, due to the prevalence of Final Fantasy VII in the gamer's consciousness. Like I said in my last video, even if you don't know Final Fantasy, you probably know something about it. But the most interesting thing here is the decision to divide the game into several parts, which we do not know yet how many there will be, and personally I think it's a bit deceiving calling this game just Final Fantasy Remake over something like Final Fantasy Remake Part 1. It is 100% for marketing purpose, but it's also for that reason that I find it mischievous. Because while a lot of people like me who do follow gaming news and know what's going on within the world of video games and its industry, knew this since before this game was even officially announced. But if you're from the outside, as someone who games more casually, and maybe you saw this remake at stores and it reminded you of your childhood or something like that, you don't know that this is only the first part of a series. Nowhere in the box does it say so, and that is particularly annoying when this is a full-fledged game. It is a 30-hour plus game like the original Final Fantasy VII, which, yes, raises a lot of questions which I will address, but also it's a whole game for better and for worse. And it just feels like they're banking on people being kinda done with the game by the end of those 30 hours, so that they don't get too annoyed when they realize this wasn't the game they thought it was gonna be. But I feel like I've been rambling a bit too much. And now let's talk about the actual game and not its marketing. Starting with the story, then clearly being only the first part of a game series, we don't really know how long it will be, and to be fair, I doubt even the team at Square Enix knew it while they were developing this particular game. But regardless, this one covers the more linear part of the story, or at least it was in the original game, that being Midgar, which means this game ends about 4 hours into the original Final Fantasy VII. And so they turned 4 hours of this game into 30 hours, which sounds crazy, but I would be the first to defend that. Out of all of Final Fantasy VII, these 4 hours are the ones that could have used more development for its world and characters. That being said, I really hope this is not the route they take for subsequent games. I really hope Remake 2 is not a 100-hour game for no reason. But that doesn't matter right now. To achieve this much longer running time to what was before the smallest part of the game, here the developers chose to add to the slum sectors, which are now a lot more like their own areas where you can do side missions and other stuff. And we will talk more about this in the gameplay department. But it's also important to talk about it here because it rearranges certain pieces of the plot for these scenes to be possible. In the original, you only really spend a few minutes in Sector 7 because there just wasn't much to do there besides progressing the story. Here they take the liberty that Cloud was there for a while, and well, he must have been doing something during that time, with that adding those side missions, but not just side missions, as some of it will be part of the main story, and that's kinda where I have a problem with it. Mostly in the later areas like Sector 5 and 6. When Cloud is in those areas, there is a certain urgency to what's going on in the story, and so having your characters mess about is a bit of a downgrade to the pacing and urgency of the original story. Even if it is more, let's be honest, more isn't always better. Surprisingly, this isn't such a problem in Sector 6, which you might know as the gambling city, before the other gambling city shows up, that it isn't in this game because the game doesn't go that far story-wise. But regardless, it isn't a problem because the side quests of that area don't come up until later in the game. But it is a problem in Sector 5 where Cloud is looking for someone after ending up in Sector 5, which yes, I'm talking in such a way not to spoil too much, even though this game can be very faithful to Final Fantasy VII. But I was also fairly spoiler free with that game, so it only makes sense here. Regardless, this Sector 5 section just kinda lets you indulge in the side quests with Aerith, and while that helps their character development, it also diminishes the flow of the actual plot, and to some extent This is a problem with Sector 7 as well, which I already talked about earlier, but again, that one at least felt a bit more justified. Now, speaking about the plot more broadly, it is what it is, a segment of an actual plot, and it feels very much Frankensteined to be just one game, especially around the end, which will involve Sephiroth, even though in the original game, Sephiroth is barely more than a name that is thrown around for this part of the story. In fact, they do this sort of like Batman Arkham Knight or Cyberpunk thing with him. If you haven't played those games, just think of Cloud as being haunted, which is as far as I'm willing to spoil. And while it makes sense knowing the plot of the original game, I'm glad they did not do this too much as the game progressed because it was kinda lame and annoying having this character interrupt the story to spill some beans, which leads me to talk about that this game spills a lot of beans, and usually for no good reason. If you play this game having played the original, then you know that things shown here will only happen towards the end of this series. Like, for example, a certain vision all the characters have in a simulator, or Rufus telling Cloud a massive spoiler about his nature, and this would be fine had they been more subtle, but they're not subtle. Both of these examples I gave happen in the main story, during major plot points, and the first one even having a whole CGI cutscene to it, which feels like it was made purely for the fans, especially those who are very excited to see what's to come in the later parts of this game and what that might look like with modern technology. And I totally get it, but it's also kinda making these games worse, especially for newcomers who these scenes will make no sense whatsoever. And isn't that something remakes should take into consideration? For Final Fantasy VII, a 24-year-old game that is in fact older than me by a couple of years, and for those reasons I think it's fair to assume that this will be a lot of people's first experience with Final Fantasy VII, which I think makes that aspect of being accessible even more important. Regardless though, it is very faithful, but there is still some stuff I want to address, including changes, but before that I want to talk about the characters. And I think this will be somewhat of a controversial opinion, but honestly I don't want to 100% claim that because I avoid looking at other people's reviews while I'm working on my own. So maybe this is a thing. Others have criticized and I just don't know. But I feel as the characters here are not that different from the original counterparts. They may have more lines, but their characters are essentially the same, which is fine for characters like Aerith and Tifa and some of the villains, who in the original only showed up for a little bit in this part of the game and whose character only really needed that more lines to flesh them out a bit. But then characters like Barrett could really have used a bit of an overhaul, because giving Barrett more lines here only pushes that he's a bit of a stereotype even further. And that sucks, because this is a full remake. This is where you get the chance to change stuff that might not have been as good in the original. Which leads me to talk about the other Avalanche team members, who in the original were mostly just cannon fodder, and now they're cannon fodder with a little bit of personality, and let me tell you about their personalities. So there are three main Avalanche members, much like in the original, and they are Biggs, who honestly gets as much development as he did in the original. He is a generic good guy, and he kinda just says things that reaffirm other characters. And I have a really hard time even thinking of a basic trait for him. Then we have Wedge, which is a comic relief character, being big and clumsy, and he says funny things sometimes. Unfortunately, his humor just did not resonate with me, and he does have some moments where he tries to be a bit more emotional and down to earth, with Cloud specifically, but these moments have a tendency of falling flat. Because up until those points, these characters were all not much more than stereotypes, and this is a problem with the three of them, especially when they try to get all emotional, like I just said, later in the game. And then our last one, Jesse, the one I actually heard about before even playing this game as a character that gets a lot of development and screen time. And half of that is true. She gets quite a lot of screen time, but her development is mostly, and I'm gonna say this in a funny way, but I honestly mean it, her personality is being horny for Cloud. And that is her whole character. I swear. I mean, she seems to care more about keeping Cloud around that she actually cares about Avalanche or any other thing in her life. And let's be honest, it's not like Cloud lacks romantic interests in this game already. Both Tifa, the childhood friend, and Aerith, the girl that likes Cloud, even though he's a bit of an ass, because he reminds her of another spoiler that shows up in this game pretty much for the fans, which connects to that problem I already talked about of stuff showing up too early. But regardless, Jessie just doesn't have what they have for a love interest, and it feels very shallow in comparison, which ends up being a deterrent to her character. And while she is important herself over some major plot elements, it isn't like the stuff that they wrote for her couldn't have just been put on any of the other two Avalanche characters and serve the exact same purpose. What I'm trying to mean by this is that she isn't particularly an important character, even if she might seem to be from the outset. But also giving all of this plot elements to her only makes the other two characters look even more like canon fodder, which leads me to be perplexed by some of the later on game plot choices with the changes, which yes leads me to talk about the changes. And while I will not, or at least try not to spoil them, but I do have to address the big ones, being the Whispers, these Dementor-like creatures that will show up at certain points through the game and heavily affect the story because they stopped characters from doing important things. And I have read online that people are considering these to be a fix to some of the more nonsensical scenes of the original, or scenes that maybe don't look as believable with the high fidelity of today's graphics, with the whole Keepers of Destiny shtick that they have going on for them. But it's because of that Destiny thing that they're going for that I think it will be more than that. We already seen changes to the story, particularly with characters' deaths, and we already seen our main characters being able to avoid and fight back these whispers of fate. And I wonder what Final Fantasy fans would want to see change in the fate of its characters. That's a real tough one there, huh? Regardless though, they do feel weird in the story, but they also help create this quasi-ending for what was originally just the opening and introduction of the game. And overall, it does help the game feel like a full product. Well, it also helps that it's like 30 hours long, but we will talk more about that as we move in to talk about the gameplay. But to finish this off, I want to say that while I enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy Remake's story, especially its main characters, Cloud is much less of an ass, which is good given we do have to deal with him for most of our journey, but it's hard to judge because it's not a full story no matter how you twist it, and it's hard to judge as is because I feel like a lot of it hinges on the changes that have been done, but we have yet to see how these changes will eventually affect the bigger picture. So I don't want to have like a heavy opinion for something I don't know how it will turn out. But now moving on to the gameplay, this is where Final Fantasy VII is at its most interesting, because if you watched my original FF7 review, this was my biggest complaint with the original game, was that it was just too slow and that its system had aged fairly poorly. But now Fantasy VII is more in the vein of the modern Final Fantasy 15, where it's much more of an action RPG, but here evolving from 15, which had somewhat of a, and I don't want to be mean, and I mean I did platinum Final Fantasy 15, but that game had somewhat very basic combat. But now, with the return of the materia and enemies being a lot more dependent on their weaknesses, adding a lot more strategy to the combat, which is good, and it's a lot more fast-paced now. But when you open up the menu to use any materia spells or just character special attacks, the game slows to a crawl, purposefully of course, similar to Final Fantasy 15 as well now that I think about it. But it makes much more sense here as the game can be a lot more overwhelming, especially at the beginning. The first mission throws quite the variety of scenarios at you that for the most part will prepare you for most of what the game might throw at you, at least have you prepared. Like having enemies that like dodging and moving a lot, making it harder for slower attacks, or enemies that can't be attacked from the front, or even enemies that can only be hit by ranged attacks. It is a game that takes a lot of advantage of being a 3D game, more than your average action RPG that mostly only takes into consideration the area and position of characters. This was something that was experimented with 15, but given in that game you could just teleport to enemies, it never really got much use. The limitation of your characters actually end up becoming its strong suits here. Barret is a long-range character with its machine gun arm, having that advantage compared to characters like Tifa and Cloud who work on close range but also tend to deal a lot more damage. And then Aerith, who is also a long-range character, but because of her magic focus that has a bigger advantage with materia spells. But in this game, due to the equipment, which while similar to Final Fantasy VII, having weapons, armor, and accessories, but I felt as here they made a bigger change to your character, with some weapons even having their own special attacks, and being able, if you want, to make Tifa, for example, a more magic character, and Aerith a physical damage character, even though that would never be ideal. But I think this liberty is here because of just the lack of playable characters compared to the original. Because the ones I just used as examples are all of them, at least that you can control. There is one more familiar face that shows up, but it is not a playable character, at least with human control. As the way Final Fantasy VII Remake works is while in combat you can switch between which character you control at any given moment, while also being able to order out spells and special attacks out of other characters while actively controlling whatever you're controlling at that moment. This being done through that menu that slows down time. I found this a bit confusing in explanation, so here is an example. While controlling Cloud, you can go through the menu and make Tifa use a healing spell without ever having to change to Tifa. This all being possible through a surprisingly simple and clean bottom layout. Square does your regular attack, while triangle does a sort of heavy attack depending on your character. For example, Cloud changes into a stance that does a lot more attack damage but also reduces mobility by quite a lot, but also being able to parry attacks while in this mode. While Barret, for example, can do a barrage of missile attacks that while they do a lot more damage, it also takes more time to recharge. Then the circle button is a dodge button, that's about it. And the cross button brings up that menu I keep talking about, for your current character at least. But if you use R2 or L2, it will bring up immediately to the menu of one of your party members, also being able to interchange between them with those buttons without ever leaving the menu. Which is nice, it's a clever system even though it does take a little bit getting used to. And if I can nitpick about it, it is a system that needs to stay as simple as it can, as the more menus you add within this slow motion menus, then the further slows down the pace of the actual game, and I found that to happen a bit with not only the spells being separate from the special attacks. Once you level up a materia spell, having to pick the level up spell in the menu as it defaults to the lowest / cheapest version of that spell at the beginning of any battle, which is a bit annoying, especially when it took me way too long, much more than I would like to admit, to even learn that you could change between levels of power within the same materia on the fly. So now let's talk about this materia. It surprisingly works very similarly to the original game. but I will explain it from the beginning anyways in case you haven't watched my review or played the original game. Materia is a way to customize the spells and some abilities of your character. For example, green materia is for spells like lightning, fire and ice, or healing spells that heal your HP, and time spells that start by making your character have a faster build up ATB bar, which I can't believe I haven't addressed the ATB bar yet, but we will in a second. But regardless, these time materia will later, when evolved, also be able to do slow, which, as it implies, it makes enemies move slower, which also leads me to talk about the evolution of materia. Much like in the original game, you can level up materia by using it, and of course, like the original game, you can link it if your armor or weapons allow it in the linking spots with support materia, a blue colored materia that for the most part enhances your other materia, and for the most part that of the green magic type. Things like making your materia evolve faster, or like the example I also gave for the original game, being able to hit multiple enemies at the same time. Then we also have command materia, this one being yellow, that allows for moves like steal, which steals an item, or sense, which allows you to see the stats of your enemy and its weaknesses. These also being in the original game, and I will say this right now, they are all in the original game. There are no new materia types. There are quite a lot new materias within those types though, given this is a completely different gameplay style. And other changes are more substantial, like for example with the summon materia. These are red ones, and before you could put them in the same slots as your other materias and you could put as many as you wanted, but now you have one special slot per character specific for the summons, meaning one, you don't have to manage between regular materia and summoning materia, but also that you can only carry one summoning materia per character, which is not a big compromise given I believe you can only do one summon per battle, but also because of the small number of summoning materia. In this game I believe there are only 6 in total without the DLC, but they are of course a lot more involved than the original summons, now actually fighting alongside you for a set amount of time, being even able to use special attacks unique to them, and when their timer runs out, they will do a sort of ultimate attack that deals, of course, loads of damage. That being said, your ability to use these summons can be a bit arbitrary, as you have to wait for a summon bar to fill up, which happens fairly fast when it shows up. The thing is that what is arbitrary is when this bar shows up. I guess this is to keep it somewhat balanced so you aren't just summoning some giant fire monster every fight. But I wish it was a bit more transparent, and it's not like Final Fantasy VII, the original, didn't have a way around this as well. Now, in terms of who these summons are, I do not want to spoil because I do think it is really cool to find out by yourself while you play, but if you have played any other Final Fantasy game, then there's a big chance you might recognize them by name alone, like Shiva or Ifrit, which have ice and fire powers respectively. Continuing with materias though, there is one left to talk about, and that is independent materias. These have pinkish color to it, and they do stand for the passive abilities. Things like stat raises or auto-activating healing spells. These are very straightforward, and I just don't have much to say about it, which actually lets me talk about something that is very important to the actual gameplay that I have yet to mention, that is the ATB system. Named after the original ATB, which was the name of the combat system of the original Final Fantasy VII, here it's just a bar that allows you to use your materia, and or special attacks. These serve to stop you from overusing attacks in a row, especially with the characters you are not actively playing with, given their ATB bars feel slower. That being said, you still have MP, that is the expendable energy to use powers with, that only replenishes at the rest or with items, much like your health bar. The ATB is very much a balanced thing, and each character has 2 ATB bars, so to say, meaning they can only do 2 spells or special attacks or combination of both in a row, at least with their base stats, as certain materia might be able to increase the amount of ATB bars temporarily. There is also a limit break bar that allows you to do special attacks like in the first Final Fantasy VII, and honestly working very similar to how it did in that game, and honestly there isn't much to say here, besides the fact that of course they look a lot better and its animations are a lot cooler, which they ought to be 20 odd years later. Now, we spent enough time talking about the mechanics of the main character, so let me talk now briefly about their enemies. Like I said earlier, they are very focused on weakness exploitations, with also having a limit break bar that slowly grows as you attack your enemy, as of course growing faster if you hit its weakness, and once this bar is full, the enemy will go into a temporary state of vulnerability, where not only will he sit there and take it, but your attacks will also do a lot more damage. So with most enemies, your main objective will be to limit break them, so to say, especially with bosses, which are by far the best part of this game, taking advantage of the crazy enemy design of the original game and making it really unique and visually impressive set pieces, even if the actual strategy to beat them might be very similar to one another. The only big problem with the enemies is, while regular enemies might be hard at the beginning, they will quickly become cannon fodder, being able to be defeated with basic attacks, not even worth limit breaking, which is fine and it makes sense given the leveling and growth of the characters, but also makes all the random encounters very boring. And by random encounters I mean enemies that will randomly show up in your path in a certain dangerous area. These don't just jump off the ground, but given the level design of each path being very linear, avoiding them is almost never an option. And now speaking of level design, it is a very linear game in its design, and if you look at your map, it becomes very obvious that this is mostly corridors full of enemies linking cities or areas together, where you are for the most part safe. There are some activities in these cities, as not only is this where you'll find side quests, but there's also some mini games, or I guess in this case activities, as these will mostly play like the base gameplay for the most part, like the arena, which is very self-explanatory, or the VR simulator, which in this case is where you can get most of the summons in this game by defeating them first in that simulator. This game is definitely not full of mini games. It's definitely not on the same level as the original, but to be fair, we still haven't reached the places that are full of activities in the story, which I feel like I'm saying a lot. And honestly, I wish they had expanded more. For example, Sector 6, given it is an area focused on entertainment, but here it mostly just, remakes what was already in the original, which is fine, but it is a bit of wasted potential, especially given that there isn't already many side quests here, and the ones that there aren't very creative. It is for the most part fetch quests, the standard go fight this monster and bring back the item. Difficulty wise, it's also pretty easy, which is weird. I always assume that the side content will be harder than the main one, but for the most part it does keep up with the difficulty of the game itself, which I guess is good given a lot of the times progressing the story means not being able to complete some of the older side quests. Now, speaking of difficulty, there are 3 initial settings you can choose from. That's normal, easy, and classic. I played on normal, which was challenging enough. That being said, It would have been nice to just have hard unlocked from the beginning, but I think what you might be more curious about here is the classic mode. Unfortunately, it is not what you may think it is. There is a reason the difficulty is below easy, and it's because it's a very easy mode. It does somewhat resemble a turn-based RPG with its camera trying to point in such a way that both you and the enemy are on opposite ends of the screen, and how enemies will wait for you to attack before they do, but also because of that feature making this very easy. Given Final Fantasy VII's big focus on enemies that defend a lot and having to limit break them was clearly not made or designed around any form of turn-based mode, and it ends up feeling like just missed potential, like big changes would need to be done to the gameplay for this to work. As it stands, it's just a very easy mode, maybe for people who the gameplay is just a bit too frenetic, and I don't hate that it's here, but they should probably not have called it classic. Leading me to talk about the graphics, which is not so much missed potential as it is a mixed bag. And what a mixed bag. It really varies between amazing with Aerith's house and the cities on the plate, and the Shinra building, or Sector 6 with its grungy nightlife neon look, and the iconic church, are all really great. It is what you expect of this game, translating from pre-rendered backgrounds into a 3D world. But there is also Sector 7, and most of the slums, and the underground labs, and the sewers, which look not only somewhat ugly, but also just very samey all throughout. And I know it's supposed to look ugly to some extent, but it just looks ugly past that. In my Final Fantasy VII review, I said that I wish there were high-resolution versions of those backgrounds because art that makes trash look beautiful deserves it. And that's the thing, Final Fantasy has already made these scenarios that should look horrible look very unique and special. But here it just kinda looks like trash with slums in between them. And with that sameness I said just now, it also doesn't help the traversal. It can be very hard to know where you are, and almost always for no good reason, especially with how linear every path already is. It is very disappointing when I know that they can put out beautiful looking things with this technology, as they clearly have with the examples I gave at the beginning. It is not for lack of talent and not for lack of tools. So what is it? Time? Budget? Who knows? And while I won't make assumptions, I will critique it. It clearly can be better. Also, the linearity does scare me a bit for the future of the series, as while this piece of game was very linear in the original, the game really opens up after that, and it's hard to know how they will deal with that, but again, not my place to judge until we see that game. While we are here talking about graphics, I will address some of the more technical aspects of it. I played this on the PS4 base version because that's what I have, and it ran fairly well. It is 30 FPS, but I did not see any noticeable slowdowns or even stutters, which is impressive given the other PS4 games I've played recently. And it doesn't seem to be making any major sacrifices for that to happen, except for doors. For some reason, I guess door textures are too much for the PS4, because the doors look awful. I have no idea why. But now for some more legit criticism that does end up affecting the gameplay is the amount of particle effects, to the point of being hard to tell what's going on the screen, especially with how fast-paced everything is. And you will recognize these pieces watching a YouTube video, because YouTube's bitrate and compression is gonna turn those moments into a party of messy pixels. Also, if I can have a small tangent about particle effects, this is definitely the thing that we're gonna remember about the PS4 and Xbox One generation. It is so overbearing in almost any game that uses it. Shout out to Shadow Warrior 2. But yeah, it's definitely the biggest gimmick of that generation. But overall, Final Fantasy VII does look good. in a technical way, but I am fairly disappointed in a lot of the aesthetic choices and a lot of the world and level design due to its linear and repetitive nature. Now, moving on to the final part of the game, an aspect I did not expect to even get close to the original's quality, and that is the soundtrack. The original soundtrack of this game is iconic, and while I don't think that people will start humming the version of this remake over the original, I do think that this game does an amazing job at picking those songs and transforming them to fit a more modern game. It is very derivative, and that's a good thing for a remake. It is a very new sound that also feels very familiar, and again, having that fit the game and its moments while retaining that familiarity is impressive to me. And I have caught myself listening to it long after I finished the game. That being said, grain of salt here, I always have loved Final Fantasy scores, and I have no knowledge of music composition, but it sounds good to my ear and it might not to yours, but I'm making a good faith appeal that I think it will. It is very magical, with its orchestral sound really creating a sense of grandness, and I really wish every part of the game was like this. But it's not, unfortunately. This feels like a taste of what Final Fantasy Remake might eventually be, and hopefully this is the smallest of the remakes and also the least ambitious given what we know of the Final Fantasy story. And a lot of the decisions made here will only have consequences in later games, so only then will we have full context for what we have here right now. But that's what I'm rating what we have here, and what we have here is a great improvement to the Final Fantasy gameplay that has been wavering for a few generations now, and the world that is incredibly beautiful when it wants to be, and a story that has yet to reach its full potential. And so for those reasons, I am giving Final Fantasy VII an 8 out of 10. I was very close to giving it a 7, but I think the gameplay is such a massive improvement, especially when that was my biggest issue with the original 7, and hell, 15 for that matter. And while the graphics have their issues, it is still an absolutely gorgeous game when it wants to be. That being said, this is a cautiously optimistic score. I'm definitely assuming that the changes made here are not going to ruin this game series and its story, and I really hope it doesn't. Now, moving on to the recommendations. Well, if you own a PS4 where the game came out, or a PS5 that has backwards compatibility and also has an improved version of the game coming to it, and you already played the original, then yeah, play this, you'll get a lot out of it. If you haven't though, I highly recommend playing the original first. Not the vanilla experience though, I do recommend, much like in my last video, to use one of the recent releases of the games, like Steam or PlayStation or Switch, releases which have built-in cheats and hacks that make for a much more smoother experience of the game nowadays. Now, if you do not have a PlayStation 4 or 5 and you are a huge fan of Final Fantasy VII, then I would not rush out to get a PlayStation, because this was one of those games that said play first on PlayStation in its commercials and promotional material, which means this is probably some form of 1-year exclusivity deal with PlayStation, like we have seen with other games, and specifically other Square Enix games. And this video comes out almost exactly a year after the game's original release, so if you're outside of that Sony ecosystem, I would recommend waiting a little bit, maybe a few months after this video comes out, to make a decision, because the likelihood of ports being released or announced soon are high. Regardless though, I hope that this video was informative and it helped you make your decision, regardless of what that is, and regardless of that, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting, all the things you can do for free on YouTube, especially since this video comes out on my birthday. Just saying, no pressure or anything. And regardless of that though, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye. And happy birthday, in case we share a birthday.